Welcome back to another episode of Two Christian Dudes, where Randy K and I have conversations with fascinating guests. We're crazy excited to have a very special guest for you today. It's a name that many of you probably know, and our guest today is Lee Strobel. He's written many books that have had a major impact in the Christian publishing space. He's got a recent book called The Case for Heaven, and he also has a related documentary that's going to be coming out in April, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So Randy, I'm going to pitch it to you. Take it away, sir.
Lee, it's a pleasure to have you and welcome to our show. This is great because our audience is really tailored to the afterlife influence or space, if you will. And I was curious, Lee, that you had your own brush with death at one point. Did that help influence your wanting to tackle the subject of the afterlife?
Yeah, absolutely. About 10 years ago, I almost died. My wife found me unconscious on the bedroom floor. She called an ambulance. I remember waking up in the emergency room and the doctor looked down at me and said, "You're one step away from a coma, two steps away from dying." And then I fell unconscious again. I had an unusual medical condition called hyponatremia, which is a severe drop in my blood sodium level. And what happens is your brain cells, with this lack of sodium, begin to take in moisture and your brain cells expand. Of course, there's no room to do that in your cranium. And so you have hallucinations, confusion, mental confusion, seizures, unconsciousness, and then death. So I hovered between life and death for quite a while until the doctors were able to save me, which has to be done very carefully or you become mentally or physically disabled. And fortunately, I came through it, but it's a very clarifying experience when you almost die. I mean, it really is. You begin to say, okay, I'm a Christian. I believe what the Bible tells me about the afterlife, but I'm also a bit of a skeptic. You know, my background's in journalism and law. So I got the skeptical side. And so I wanted to know what is science? What is philosophy and history and so forth? What do they tell me about the reality of heaven and hell, the reality of an afterlife? And that's what launched me on the quest to write the book and then create the movie.
And Lee, I'm curious to hear how you decided who you were going to interview as a part of the book in the film. You talked to a few friends of Randy and mine. We've done quite a bit of content with John Burke. We've interviewed Howard Storm as well. One of the stories that John shares in the film is Heidi Barr's story when a horse falls on her and she has her own near-death experience. So, but you didn't just talk with people who were experts in the near-death experience space or people who've had their own near-death experience. You had a very broad cast of characters, some people who really surprised me. So in terms of some of the key voices you brought in, how are they a part of painting the picture that you want to paint with the book and with the film?
Well, we wanted to get different perspectives. So we were able to get Francis Chan, who I thought is kind of rare, kind of hard to get him to participate in a project like that. And I thought he had some great insights. Sharon Diricks, who's a neuroscientist with a PhD from Cambridge University, an expert on the soul. And she wrote a book called Am I Just My Brain?, which shows that, no, we're not just a physical brain, but we have a consciousness, a soul, a spirit that can survive our physical death. John Burke and I go way, way back. We were on the staff of a church together, I don't know, 30 years ago or something like that. And so we've known each other a long, long time. Of course, he is a Christian pastor who's also researched 1,000 near-death experiences and wrote a book called Imagine Heaven. And so when I do, I've done, a lot of books, and my approach is that I don't have to be the expert. If I can go out and find leading experts and scholars, and then I ask them the tough questions I had as a skeptic and see if they can provide good answers. So I spent a lot of time trying to determine who's credible, who can speak into these issues with expertise and in a convincing way. And I think we had a good range of people in the film.
I think you did as well. And, what's interesting to me, Lee, is that you had written The Case for Christ a number of years ago, and that was obviously highly successful and helpful for a lot of people. But in The Case for Heaven, you mentioned that you sourced evidence outside of the Bible.
Yeah.
And so tell us about that. How did you discover that kind of evidence in exception to the Bible?
Yeah, I wanted to look at what does science, for instance, tell us about the what the Bible teaches about near-death experiences, about the afterlife, and so forth. And so, by looking at what science tells us about a consciousness or a spirit or a soul, it confirms what the Apostle Paul said, which is to be absent from the body, to be present with the Lord. Or when Jesus told the criminal on the cross, today you'll be with me in paradise. So the suggestion is that at our time of death, our spirit, our soul, our consciousness separates from our physical body and continues on until the final resurrection, the end of history, where Jesus consummates history, returns, there's final judgment, and then we spend eternity in a very physical place, whether it's heaven or hell. So by looking at what neuroscience tells me, it gives me confidence. Yeah, the Bible's telling the truth about the fact that we have a soul. In fact, the Bible mentions the soul many, many times, but it never really defines it. And the reason is it presupposes, of course, we have a soul. We don't need to stop and give the evidence for it. We know, of course, we have a soul. And then near-death experiences is another bit of extra biblical evidence, evidence outside the Bible. And what I looked at in near-death experiences are those that I could corroborate, where there were things seen or experienced by someone in an out-of-body experience that would be impossible if the experience wasn't real. And of course, there was one scientific study done of 93 people who had verifiable observations during their near-death experience. And they studied those cases and found that 92% of those verifiable observations turned out to be absolutely perfectly accurate. Another 6% were almost perfectly accurate. So we got like 98% accuracy. And then, of course, you have John Burke, who's done a lot of research that's shown that when you look at the common elements of a near-death experience, and you don't look at how people interpret it, but what actually takes place, they're actually consistent with Christian theology. That was a breakthrough for me, too, because I was a skeptic about near-death experience. I mean, when I went into it, I thought, no, these are hallucinations because of oxygen deprivation or something like that. And yet I found the Lancet, which is the famous medical journal in England, carried an analysis of near-death experiences that concluded that none of the alternative explanations can fully explain away this phenomenon.
Randy, I'm going to get in one more question, and then I'll let you run with the rest of the interview. One of the things, Lee, that Randy and I have seen between the books that we've been promoting and also the many interviews we've done is in the midst of the last 2 years with the pandemic, fear of death, and just fear and the unknown, generally speaking, has really drawn people to heaven stories and afterlife encounters in a way that I haven't seen for a while. I mean, things in Christian retail have waves. Heaven stories were really popular for a while, and then they quieted down. And now these really heaven stories tied to near-death experiences, there's a high demand for them. I'd just love for you to speak a little bit to how that fear of death ties into people really tuning into these sorts of stories.
Yeah, I mean, studies have shown that 29% of Americans either have had a family member or they know someone who's died during the COVID pandemic. My brother died at the beginning of the pandemic. So people, I think, are sensitized to death as a result. They begin questioning what does happen in the afterlife. My wife, Leslie, and I were at a restaurant, and the waitress was, I don't know, maybe 18-year-old young woman. And we got talking to her, and all of a sudden she burst into tears. And we said, "What's wrong?" She said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." She said, "I almost didn't come into work today. We just lost a family member to COVID." And I thought, here's a young woman, about 18 years old, probably never thought about death before, probably never pondered the afterlife before, but now death has come knocking on her family's door. And now you can see the concern, the anxiety, the apprehension in her eyes. And I think it's just representative of what's going on in our world. I think you're right. This is a time when people are especially concerned with what do we know? What can we know? What can we be confident of in terms of the afterlife?
Yeah, and there are different perspectives that you bring out in the movie and in your book, Lee, that really cross the threshold of different theological beliefs. That is universalism, for example. There's the Christian theological beliefs, certainly in the afterlife and heaven. and then there's reincarnation and those
Yeah.
kinds of beliefs. How did you study those and come up with the evidence to determine the validity of those kinds of differing accounts?
Yeah, I interviewed a scholar by the name of Dr. Chad Meister, who's a PhD from Marquette University in philosophy, who's an expert on evidence for the faith. And he talks about what he calls the heaven pyramid. And so, in other words, he looks at a series of questions to try to discern what makes the most sense, what is consistent with reality in terms of the afterlife. And so he started a very broad issue. What is truth? Well, truth is that which corresponds to reality. So you settle what is truth. And then you go up and up further in this pyramid, and you look at things like different worldviews. What are the different worldview possibilities? And then you evaluate each of those. You look at atheism, you look at pantheism, you look at theism. We conclude, and of course, the book has more details on this, that theism has the most evidence for it. Then you look at Christianity and whether it has any elements that make it especially credible. And that brings us to the resurrection of Jesus, which is what brought me originally from atheism to faith, was the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And so when you do have such strong historical data that Jesus not only claimed to be the Son of God, but he backed it up by returning from the dead, then you can say with confidence, well, then he's an eyewitness to the afterlife, so we ought to listen to what he says. And secondly, it confirms his identity of being the Son of God. Therefore, he created the afterlife. So he ought to know what he's talking about. And so that gives credibility, I think, extra credibility to what Jesus talks about when he discusses the afterlife. So I go through this process, too much to go through on a show, but it really weeds out what are the alternatives. And, we look at reincarnation. I interviewed Dr. Douglas Groothuis, who's written many books on Eastern religions and studied reincarnation and whether that's credible, and show that there are too many logical inconsistencies with reincarnation, I believe, to make it a credible worldview. So you have to kind of look at the alternatives, weigh them out. And I personally concluded that only Christianity has the backing of the historical data that give us confidence as telling us the truth about what happens when we die.
Yeah, and that's interesting that you say that, Lee, because, Sean and I have been in this space of the afterlife and interviewing people who've had these various accounts, including John Burke. Yeah. And you had mentioned that you were a skeptic of NDEs going into this study.
Definitely.
And it was not analogous, I guess, to you being a skeptic of Jesus as real or who he said he was when you were an atheist. So what was the turning point that caused you to believe in these type of accounts?
It really was the corroboration. That's what convinced me. If someone tells me, "Oh, I died, I went to heaven, I met Jesus, he's 5'10", got brown eyes, really nice guy," okay, maybe that may be true, but I don't know. I don't have corroboration of that, and so the skeptic in me doesn't want to give that as much credibility as when I have someone who sees things, hears things, experiences things during the out-of-body experience that they could not have otherwise seen or experienced. And I think of the example of the one study done of 21 blind people, many of them blind since birth, who were able to see during their near-death experiences, many for the first time. I mean, as one researcher said, this is scientifically impossible. That's the kind of corroboration that to me is convincing. I think of the case of the 7-year-old girl, a 7 or 9-year-old girl who drowned and had massive brain swelling, had no measurable brain waves, had no heartbeat for 20 minutes, and was brought to the hospital. And she's in a state of clinical death. They have her hooked up to machines to kind of keep her body going while they figure out what to do. And she does end up recovering. And she says, "I was conscious the whole time. In fact, one night after my parents had visited me, I followed them home." And she described what happened in their home that night. She described her mom made chicken with rice for dinner. She described what their parents were wearing. She described what her brother was doing thing with the G.I. Joe Jeep on the floor. She described what her sister was doing. How do you explain this if indeed her spirit did not actually do what she said it did and follow her family home that night? So that's the kind of corroboration I found especially compelling. And we have lots of cases like that. And so that made me a believer that that these are more than just oxygen deprivation or hallucinations, that these are very real experiences.
And I don't think, Lee, that you going into this study, obviously you elucidate the facts and the data and the corroboration of these various stories, but you have also taught in the church.
Yeah.
And the church at large has not been as easily convinced that these are true. In fact, there are very few messages that are taught from the pulpit about heaven and the afterlife.
Yeah.
And curious to get your take on that as to why you think that the Christian church, some have even mentioned that or said that they thought that the Christian church was even hostile to these stories. Can you talk to that?
I think in some cases there is some hostility. I think it's because they don't really understand. I think John Burke really did groundbreaking work in his research where he was able to show that people interpret these experiences differently. But let's get to the bottom line of not how you interpret it, but what actually takes place. And there's a commonality to many of these near-death experiences. And when you look at what actually occurs, it's consistent with what the Bible teaches about the afterlife. That was a breakthrough for me. I've preached at some of the largest churches in America on near-death experiences and the evidence for them, because I believe they're consistent with Christian theology. And I don't think we need to fear them. For instance, Gary Habermas, probably the world's leading expert on the resurrection of Jesus, PhD, Dr. J.P. Moreland, one of the great Christian philosophers. They've been writing about near-death experiences. I think their book on immortality dates back to like 1992 or something, or maybe 94, but way back there. And they talked about these things. So not everybody has been hostile toward it. R.C. Sproul, well-known Christian theologian, said we ought to be looking into this stuff. He was very open to investigating these issues. And I found personally that these instances of both going to a positive experience in a near-death experience or a negative experience can be helpful in pointing people toward God. So I think of Howard Storm, who was an atheist who had a horrible experience as he was ripped apart by demons during his near-death experience, rescued by God from that. When you see him talk about that in the film, and you realize that he not only, as a result of this, abandoned his atheism and quit his tenured position at a secular university, and not only became a Christian, but became an ordained minister and is now a pastor of a little church. This was transformational for him. So I think these are really worth looking at, and I think they do provide some corroboration the Bible's telling us the truth.
Yeah, it's and Howard we've interviewed as well, and it's a fascinating story, of course.
Yes.
You are what I would call an expert in apologetics. That is the study of, well, I'll let you tell us what that is to the audience, because basically what we are discovering through these various accounts is that people's faith in God, in Christ, is being established in a way that we have not seen previously.
Yes.
And can you speak to that as this advent? You talked about the pandemic, of course, but the advent of this increase of not only interest, but also the building of faith that maybe some other means of teaching have not accomplished.
Yeah, I think you're right. Apologetics means not apologizing for something, but giving reasons for the hope that we have, for giving evidence and answers that support the truth of the Christian faith. So bringing in evidence of science and history and philosophy and so forth. And near-death experiences, I think, can be a persuasive tool for a lot of people who say, I'm not quite ready to trust what the Bible tells me, but you know what? There have been 900 scholarly articles on near-death experiences published in medical and scientific journals over the last 40 years. This is a well-researched area, and I believe it can point people toward God. In fact, I did not only my major book, The Case for Heaven, but I did a smaller little book that people can get for $1 on Amazon that's called Why Believe in Heaven. And I did that for non-believers who just want access to the basic evidence. It's 64 pages, condenses the main book into the essential points. And I did that because I wanted a tool that people could get in bulk and give away. I had a hospice minister call me recently and say, I've got a bunch of these because my hospice patients are hungry for this. They can't get through a 250-page book, but they might get through this smaller book. So, and I believe the film is going to point a lot of people toward God through the evidence of Scripture, but also through the evidence of near-death experiences.
Yeah, I agree with you, Lee. And, a lot of Christians and even non-Christians want to watch films that relate to the topic you're talking about in the Christian space. Where can people go to see the film? I know I think it's coming out April 4th, is it? Or
that's right. If they go to the website, thecaseforheavenmovie.com, thecaseforheavenmovie.com, they can see the trailer. They can buy tickets. It's in movie theaters only 3 nights, April 4th, April 5th, and April 6th, in over 1,000 theaters coast to coast. So you can buy tickets right there in the website. I just got a call from a church that's renting out a movie theater with 212 seats. And so people can invite their spiritually curious friends to come with them to experience this together. So I'm hoping the churches use it as an outreach opportunity. I also did a 6-week video-driven curriculum on the case for heaven and hell that it may be a good follow-up for churches to use in small group experiences. But I'm hoping that, by the way, the movie will later stream on a streaming platform. We're still negotiating with different streaming platforms. We don't know which one yet, but ultimately it'll stream. But I think there's something about this film is a beautiful film. The cinematography is awesome. We traveled all over the country, from Portland, Oregon to Louisiana to Illinois to Phoenix, all over the place, filming this movie. And the music is original and powerful. The interviews, the cinematography, to experience it on a big screen is going to be much more impactful than watching it later on a streaming service. So I'm hoping people will show up on one of those 3 nights and check it out.
Yeah, Sean, maybe it should be excuse the pun, heavenly experience. But I'm also interested, and people will have to wait to watch the movie or read the book to learn about hell as well, because hell is a very touchy subject for a lot of people. Hell is mentioned a lot of times in the Bible, and you talk about that, and you have it in the movie as well about hell and what that's like. And you mentioned Howard Storm, and there's some accounts that we've had with people about hell. So I don't know how much time we have, Sean, to get into hell, but that would not be a good way to end this, would it?
No, we're going to end on a positive note, Randy. Lee, I couldn't agree with you more. The cinematography was fantastic. And I've watched quite a bit of content that Howard Storm has done through the years just to prep for the interview that Randy and I did with him. And I felt like just how you guys shot him was one of the best representations I've ever heard of Howard sharing his story and his testimony. So that was probably my favorite part of the film, was seeing Howard
encouraging.
And how you packaged it up.
I saw the Howard Storm scene in the movie. I had tears in my eyes. That was so powerful to me.
Yes, you guys did a fantastic job with that. So Lee's book, The Case for Heaven, widely available right now wherever great Christian books are sold. We'll have links for that in the description and the show notes for the episode. We'll also have links to the website Lee mentioned, so you can pre-order tickets for the film, find out where the film is going to be available in your area. And like Lee said, if you're a pastor or a leader, buy out a theater and invite your congregation, your staff, friends, family, whoever, pack things out and really help people get a hold of the case for heaven. As Randy and I have seen in the last 8-9 months, as we've been on our journey doing all these interviews, when people encounter these near-death experiences, afterlife encounters, it really makes a difference. It really bolsters and strengthens their faith. Uh, Lee, I want to give you a last word here before we wrap up in terms of whether it's your book or the film. If you make an impact on every person that encounters this content, what's the takeaway? How do you hope you've challenged or impacted their faith journey?
I hope it causes people who are not believers, who are skeptics, or who are spiritually curious to take a step toward faith. I hope it. I hope it intrigues them. I hope it opens their mind and heart, and I hope for believers it encourages them and says, you know what, this is not based on make believe, wishful thinking, legend, or mythology. This is based on solid evidence, biblical and scientific as well. So I hope people will, of whatever background, will walk away encouraged and with hope.
Well, Lee, thank you so much for being a part of this episode of Two Christian Dudes. We know this is a core topic that our audience is very interested in, so be sure to show your support. Head out and buy a copy of the book. Head out and support the film when it is theaters and when it's available on streaming as well. So, Lee, again, truly our honor to have you on the show. Thanks for being a part of this episode of Two Christian Dudes.
I really appreciate it. God bless you guys and all your viewers.
Thank you, Lee. God bless you.
Thank you.
Until next time, take care and God bless.